Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Saoirse Healey, and tonight I am joined in the studio with me via Autolink, former MSP for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine and former Government Minister Maureen Watt. Maureen, how are you this evening?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Enjoying this bit of weather that seems to be a bit warmer, thank goodness at last.
Hopefully it's chugging along into summer.
Yeah.
So we will start as always with our Ukraine update. It's day 449 of the war. For the ninth time this month, Russia targeted missiles at Kyiv overnight in a clear escalation ahead of the much anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive. A person has been killed in Russian military strikes on Odessa. The military administration spokesperson Serhiy Bratchuk has said two people were injured. Rail traffic has been suspended between Simferopol, the capital of the Crimean Peninsula, and the city of Sevastopol after a freight train carrying grain was derailed. The Black Sea grain deal has been extended for another 2 months in what the UN Security Secretary General Antonio Guterres hailed as good news for the world. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has told a top Chinese envoy that talks in Kyiv that Ukraine would not accept any proposals to end the war that involve losing territory or freezing the conflict. Court documents have shown that Jack Teixeira, the US Air National Guard member charged with being behind the so-called Pentagon leaks of highly classified military documents, was warned repeatedly over his mishandling of classified material. Moldova is no longer using Russian natural gas or electricity after cutting its dependence since war started in Ukraine, Prime Minister Dorian Rishian said today. The EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell has asked the EU government to add 3.5 billion euros to the European Peace Facility Fund, used to finance military aid for Ukraine. Hungary, though, said it would block the next tranche of EU military support and any new sanctions against Russia unless Ukraine removes the Hungarian bank OTP from its list of war sponsors. The UK can support Ukraine's military campaign by enabling other countries that wish to supply fighter jets to do so. The UK Defence Minister Ben Wallace has said. Dutch Foreign Minister Wopke Hoekstra said that there was no progress to report to international talks on the possibility of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. The German government is looking into mechanisms to secure war damages for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including the possibility of using Russian assets. The number of Kazakhs who believe neighboring Russia may invade the former Soviet Republic has doubled over the past 6 months, an opinion poll by Kazakh researchers has shown on Wednesday. The Central Asian country of 20 million has close ties with Moscow, but has maintained neutrality in the Ukrainian conflict, refusing to recognize Russia's annexations. Ukraine has denied that a Russian hypersonic missile had destroyed a US-made Patriot missile defense system during an airstrike on Kyiv. Two US officials said a Patriot system had probably been damaged but did not appear to have been destroyed. Ukrainian military spokesperson Serhiy Chiratiyev has claimed Ukrainians have made new advances in Bakhmut. Maureen, what do you make of the clearly rising fears in Kazakhstan that the Russian aggression could spread across more national borders?
Well, I think anyone who borders Russia at the moment must be feeling very tense and nervous and anxious about exactly what will happen because with Putin, we've got absolutely no idea what scheme will be in his head next. Although I would, Ukraine seems the most important one to him, important country to retake under Russia and to have his dream of expanding to have the former Soviet Union again. So I wouldn't have thought he'd want to dissipate his resources quite yet to other countries, but that's what makes the war in Ukraine so crucial, and that he cannot be seen to win that, because other countries, as I say, round about him will then be even more nervous than they are now.
And what impact do you think that Ukraine's very clear statement that there will be no ceasefire, there will be no end to the war unless the complete return of territory has been given? How do you think that that will impact the kind of peace talks that are going on?
Well, I think so long as war is raging, both countries, have to be seen to be strong and not giving an inch, either verbally or physically or geographically, territorial, whatever you want to say. Um, but and obviously we're not hearing anything from the talks, whether it be China, or did I hear South Africa wanted to try and intervene in Israel too. So I think probably, especially on the Ukrainian side, there's fighting talk, as well as hopefully some diplomatic moves. But I don't think Ukraine should be seen to be giving an inch, because of what I said in answer to your previous question.
And do you think the involvement of South Africa and Israel and China, do you think that this is a kind of genuine move for peace, or do you think it's slightly more an interplay of the geopolitics at the moment?
Oh, I've really not given that much thought. You have to remember that, smaller countries can be, and less high profile countries can sometimes be good at getting negotiations started. Remember when Norway nearly got a deal in the Middle East? Oh, it's quite a number of years ago now, and it was okay until the big players came in and kind of scuppered it all. So I think that any country who feels that they've got the diplomatic skills and the necessary rapport with both sides should be making every effort to get peace talks going. And I think it being looked at by different countries is perhaps a good thing too. And let them get on with it until it really reaches a very crucial stage. But then, of course, we don't know what effect um, Zelensky's spring, nearly summer now, offensive is going to result in. But I'm sure the citizens of Ukraine, do want an early end to this, but without giving up the sovereignty of their country.
And I guess just remains to be seen how these peace talks will proceed.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next story of the night, the World Meteorological Organization has published a latest report, the Global Annual to Decadal Climate Update, which has been published today. And it has found that there is a 98% chance that one of the next 5 years will be the warmest year on record for the entire planet. The record, which has been produced by the Met Office for the WMO, which also cites that there is a 2 in 3 chance that global average temperature in the next one of the next 5 years, that's 23 to 27, will temporarily exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Dr. Leon Hermansen, one of the Met Office scientists today behind the report, has said that the report shows that the next 5 years are expected to bring new temperature records. These new highs will be fueled almost completely by the rise of heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but the anticipated development of the naturally occurring El Nino event will also release heat from tropical Pacific. Key findings from this report summarized that there is a 66% chance that annual global surface temperature will temporarily exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels for one of the next 5 years. there's a 98% likelihood that at least one of the next 5 years will be the warmest on record. And El Nino and human-induced climate change will likely combine to fuel global temperature increases in the next year. Arctic heating is predicted to be more than 3 times higher than the global average. This report does not mean that we will permanently exceed the 1.5 degree level specified in the Paris Agreement, which refers to longer-term warming over many years. However, the WMO is sounding the alarm that we will breach the 1.5 level on a temporary basis with increasing frequency, according to the WMO Secretary General, Professor Petteri Talas. The average global temperature in 2022 was about 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 average. The cooling influence of La Nina conditions over the past 3 years temporarily reined in the longer warming trend. However, La Nina trend ended in March 2023, and El Nino is forecast to develop in the coming months. Typically, El Nino increases global temperatures in the year after it develops. In this case, that would be next year, 2024. The annual mean global near-surface temperature for each year between 2023 and 27 is predicted to be between 1.1 degrees and 1.8 degrees higher than the 1850 to 1900 average. And this is used as a baseline to represent pre-industrial temperatures before the emission of greenhouse gases from human and industrial activities. Now, there's a 98% chance of at least one of the next 5 years beating the temperature record, which was set in 2016, where there was an exceptionally strong El Nino weather pattern. Maureen, what do you think? So there's a sense of inevitability in this report. What do you think that can be done to prepare for the results and the outcomes of global warming, of the climate crisis?
I don't think I'd be sitting here if I knew the answers to that. I'm sure somebody would have snapped me up and paid me lots of money for it. But to be serious for a minute, this is very worrying, and we'll put those countries and those areas that are already on edge from extraordinary weather conditions really much further. I mean, we're seeing record-breaking floods in the center of Italy at the moment, which were probably not expected. And while we see countries making efforts to put in flood defenses and things, there's many areas and many types of unusual weather conditions where we simply cannot predict when they're going to happen, and make preparations for them. So this should really be worrying us all. And over the next 5 years, I don't think there's anything that individuals or countries can be doing that shouldn't already be in their programs to mitigate climate change. And I think we'll come on to talk about a story later, which is one where it could affect the burning of fossil fuels and things like that. So a move, if we could get an acceleration of a move away from burning fossil fuels, that would be helpful, but doubtful, I think. And I don't know if it's going to be something that's discussed at the G7 in Japan this week. I hadn't heard that it is, but it should be on their agenda and the agenda of every government at every cabinet meeting throughout the world, to see what each country can do to mitigate the disasters that look likely to befall on us.
So we have a bit more information on the flooding in Italy that you mentioned. So these floods are in the northern Emilia-Romagna region, and they have claimed 13 lives as of this evening. An estimated 20,000 have been left homeless in a disaster that caused 23 rivers to burst their banks and 280 landslides, engulfing 41 cities and towns. Roads remain blocked, including the A1, after the landslide in Sasso Marconi this afternoon, and the trains were cancelled or disrupted. Older and disabled people are trapped in their homes as rescuers worked under pounding rain throughout the night to save people from the most catastrophic flooding to affect Italy in 100 years. Among the dead were an elderly couple trapped inside their home in Cava, a hamlet in the province of Forli Cesena. Firefighters have carried out 2,000 rescue operations across the region and in parts of central Marche that were also affected by the floods. 40 elderly people were saved from a care home overnight as people were inundated with calls seeking help. Elderly people who sought refuge on rooftops were saved by helicopters, as were entire families. Volunteers carrying people out of their homes. The floods have destroyed homes and shops and left more than 5,000 farms underwater, according to Coldieteri, Italy's largest agricultural association. In 2022, the hottest year on record for Italy, 310 extreme weather events were registered, causing the death of 29 people, according to Legambiente, an environmental group. 13 people were killed in the floods in Marche last September, and 12 people, including several children, died in a landslide on the Isle of Ischia in late November. Now, obviously, these events are this flood has broken a record because they experienced two extreme flooding, two extreme cases of rain just within the 14 days. Do you think that this is just showing us how climate change is going to hit different regions unequally? There's not going to be a equal distribution of the effects of climate change.
I think what it's shown is that, these floods or storms or tornadoes can really hit anywhere now, and they're not confined to one particular area of the world. And it's a combination of extreme heat at some times, and then severe rain, which the water has got nowhere to go because the ground is so dried up and impacted. And all this rain falling on it just causes mud and landslides, which is what is more likely to contribute, to death. So unfortunately, so this is going to have a widespread impact, not just on Italy, but you said that a lot of agricultural products have obviously been destroyed. They have been at the beginning of their growing season. It's unlikely that they'll be able to get a second planting in before the extreme heat of summer. And we've seen already how extreme heat in Spain has meant that we had no tomatoes for ages. Or that is at least one of the reasons. So this has an impact globally, regardless of where things happen in the world.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that this is illustrating, what, as discussed in the previous story, what the potential effects of this temperature rise could be?
Absolutely. And the worrying thing is that because of the predictions that we talked about earlier, it's likely to get worse, not better. And the idea that we can do nothing just doesn't wash anymore. We really have to be doing the maximum that we can to mitigate the effects of climate change, but to stop the emission of greenhouse gases. And it's incumbent on us all to try and do that, and for governments to increase the move away from fossil fuels. But none of it's easy, and none of it can be done overnight. I mean, one of the things that we have to do is get different central heating in our homes if you're on the gas grid. And that the technology there is coming, but it's not coming at a faster enough rate to get the gas pipes modified to take hydrogen, for example. So Well, as you travel around Scotland, you see some councils are better at others on putting solar panels on public buildings. In other places, that's just not happening. So we need everybody to step up to the plate and see what they can do um, individually, personally, on a family basis, a business basis, and what they can do to mitigate climate change.
And you mentioned the need for governments to also be stepping up and pursuing these kinds of policies. What do you make of the effectiveness of these huge international climate summits? We've got the Paris Agreement, we had COP26, we've got COP28 coming up in November this year. Do you think that that's a realistic way to tackle climate change? Do you think it could actually be effective?
Well, obviously, they have become a bit of a media circus, and the media focus on it hugely, whichever country it is, and we saw that in Glasgow a couple of years ago. Nevertheless, I do think these international gatherings are important because you can learn from each other in the exhibitions away from the main conference hall about what areas there are for mitigating climate change and the different technologies that are being explored, and they can come together on stalls in an exhibition hall. So I think that is important, and also meeting people who may be able to take things forward in different countries. So in that sense, I do think that they are quite important, and also um, chivying along other countries that maybe are not as fast along the route as they should be. And also, Nicola Sturgeon talking about I've forgotten the name of the thing, where you're mitigating, having a fund to mitigate disasters that come from climate change. So these things I think are important, although, as I say, it did become and has become a bit of a media circus. And I hope things, like with any conference and exhibition and things, that things are started there, people meet together, and then they're progressed away from the glare of the media.
Mm-hmm. So we are moving on to the next story. Tory donors have been revealed to have used ministerial access to Matt Hancock, seeking COVID contracts for firms that they were involved with. Now, these newly released WhatsApp messages and emails between Tory donors and the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock have revealed the extent of ministerial access when the government COVID contracts were being awarded. Two major donors to the Conservative Party, Mustafa Mohammed and Mohammed Amarsi, had direct access to Hancock and used it to promote their companies offering COVID services with which they were involved. Amarsi also had a phone meeting with James Bethel, a health minister at the time, in which he put forward projects with which he was connected. Both Mohammed and Amarsi have said that they made no financial gains from the contracts, that they acted purely to help in a time of national crisis. Hancock insisted that the contacts were in response to a call for help with testing and that all leads were passed on to officials in an appropriate way. However, these messages raised new concerns about the influence politically connected people had during the pandemic as a result of their relationships with Tory ministers. The government has been forced to admit to its use of the controversial VIP PPE contract lanes, which was subsequently ruled unlawful. Mohammed, who has donated £234,000 to the Conservatives, and his company Genix Healthcare has donated a further £156,000, messaged Hancock on the 11th of June 2020 with a proposal. He suggested that Genix, which operates in the UK dental clinics, partners with a global crisis management company, Ecolog, to set up a rapid testing service. Early the next morning, Hancock replied, "Very interesting," and asked Mohammed to email details to his office. Ecolog was then referred by Hancock's officials into the government VIP priority lane. Within a week, Mohammed had met the team at the Department of Health and Social Care. A legal letter of intent was signed by the DHSC on the 4th of September 2020, which guaranteed a multi-million pound payment to Ecolog, even if the full contract was not issued. The following year, the DHSC decided it did not want to proceed and gave Ecolog £38 million in settlement for mobilisation costs, including a profit component. The DHSC confirmed that no services were provided by the company. The messages were disclosed after Freedom of Information requests were made by the campaign group Good Law Project. The GLP director, Joylyn Moham, said no one who followed the ongoing scandal that is COVID procurement will be surprised to learn a minister was directly involved in a huge contract award that failed to deliver. What we are desperately in need of is an independent review into how this happened over and over again. Mercy, another Tory donor, promoted a company called Oxed, which had developed rapid COVID tests. He recommended the company in a phone meeting in June 2020 with the Health Minister, Lord Bethell. A spokesperson for Oxed's parent company, Prenetics, said zero business and zero approval for Oxed was facilitated by Mohammed or Mercy, and that it won no UK government contracts. So the Conservative government has obviously come under huge amounts of fire for all of the scandals that broke due to the COVID, the handling of it. For you, is this just another example of the cronyism within the Conservative Party?
Absolutely. And, it's funny, but, we just expect this sort of thing to come out from Westminster and the Tory government at regular intervals now, don't we? They are totally and utterly shameless. And COVID gave them an opportunity to be more shameless than usual. And it's great that we're having this investigation into COVID and these things are coming to light. But is anything likely to be done about it? Is any money likely to be recouped? We know that the government has more or less given up on recouping money from these bogus companies that set up to benefit from the furlough scheme. And we know, more closer to home, Michelle Mone and her husband trying to benefit and benefiting from exactly the same things as the two companies that you're talking about tonight. So it doesn't surprise anymore, but I really do hope that people remember all this when it comes to the chance that we will have to get rid of this sleazy government in the election, which can't come soon enough. But it does mean that hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money has been wasted at a time where every penny is important or should be important to government, and certainly is to most individuals who are feeling the pinch through rising food prices and rising energy prices at the moment. It's an utter scandal, and it's little wonder that the UK is a laughing stock throughout the world. But it's more serious than that. It's that people could think it's okay to make money out of a desperate situation that the COVID pandemic was, and without having any experience in providing PPE and whatever. It was just awful.
It's absolutely shocking. Yeah, no, it's not the easiest story to hear. So moving on, the National Grid has called for regulation changes as profits have jumped to £4.6 billion. The National Grid has called for a bold overhaul of the UK's electricity grid regulations to shorten the decade-long delays in connecting green projects to energy systems, after reporting a jump in annual profits to almost £4.6 billion. The FTSE 100 monopoly, which is charged with running most of the UK's power grids, said its underlying operating profits climbed by 15% to £4.58 billion pounds for the financial year ending in March, compared with the 12 months before. The company has undergone fire in the recent months as it emerged that many renewable energy projects will be forced to wait more than a decade to begin generating clean power after a massive increase in the number of developers applying for a grid connection. The UK plans to run its grid entirely on clean energy by 2035, but many renewable energy projects have been told they will need to wait until at least the late 2030s to get connected to the grid. Earlier this week, the Ofgem chief executive, Jonathan Brearley, described the delays as unacceptable and criticised a legacy of stalled, unviable, and often highly speculative zombie projects, blocking ready-to-go solar, wind, and other renewable energy schemes behind them. Brearley rebuffed the National Grid's criticism of its regulation, telling an industry conference that it had removed all barriers to National Grid investing in grid expansion and upgrades ahead of applications through its Invest and Connect policy. National Grid is the backbone of the UK's energy system and owns most of its mains electricity transmission lines, as well as smaller regional grids, with Electricity Systems Operator ESO responsible for managing power supplies to keep the lights on. The company's annual profits followed a surge in profits from its electricity distribution business, which climbed by 39% from the previous year to 1.2 billion for the year to the end of March. The profits increase follows an 11% rise in operating profit to nearly 4 billion the year before, helped in part by the leap in electricity market prices that increased revenues from subsea cables connecting with Europe. So this follows a big trend. We've seen huge increases in the profits from fossil fuel companies, Shell, BP, and now the National Grid is reporting huge amounts of profit. What do you think is the impact and the links between this trend?
Yeah, seems to be a link or a theme running through our stories tonight. This one goes back to our original one about the increase in temperatures over the next 5 years. Now, here's a classic example, and the SNP have been calling for, as long as I can remember, for changes to the grid because, in Scotland, suppliers of energy have got to pay the grid to in order to get their power onto the grid, whereas down south they're paid to put their electricity into the grid. So here's an opportunity to right away for the regulations, which I don't know what they are, but the regulation changes to be made by the government right away, enact a bill right away so that the profits, before they're distributed to shareholders, can be used to invest in better power lines and get the green energy, of which we are now plentiful in Scotland, into the national grid and used and accelerate the move away from fossil fuels. Am I hopeful that that might happen? No, but that is actually what should happen by any decent forward thinking government.
And how should Scotland gain independence? How do you think that will progress in Scotland, practically the shift away from fossil fuels and towards the green energy? Obviously, it's a very energy rich nation.
Yes, and we're already producing a maximum, well, not the maximum amount of electricity, but enough electricity for our own uses, and can export it. And, we could become, I mean, you talk to companies and bodies in this field, and they say that, the green revolution can be as profitable to Scotland as the oil and gas discoveries were, but it's not being harnessed again to the benefit of the citizens of the country. So, with an independent Scotland, surely we could take control of our energy sources and the grid, and make sure that Scots were getting the benefit from it, and we could export the energy to the benefit of Scotland. I mean, you see, as you go about the north and the northeast areas on the coastline where the cables are coming in from the offshore wind farms, and there are moves to create another line like the Bewley Denny line. And these things, although some people hate them and object to them, they are the future. Um, Maybe some could be undergrounded, but there is an urgency to getting this done so that we move away from fossil fuels more quickly. And these obscene levels of profits, if a government can change the rules for the national grid, which of course used to be in public hands, I think, should be used for the benefits of citizens, not for the benefits of shareholders and profiteers. And I would have thought, as I said earlier, that I was going to say right-thinking government, but a government that wants to do the right thing should be thinking about. But I'm not holding my breath that this government will do that.
Yeah, hopefully Scotland's future is very much in green. So, next story of the night, Burberry bosses have said that Brexit VAT charges puts the UK at a competitive disadvantage. This comes after the CEO of Burberry has complained that the UK is at this competitive disadvantage for global shoppers, which has held back sales in its home market after the government ditched a VAT tax break for tourists. Jonathan Akeroyd, the chief executive of the luxury British brand, best known for its signature check and raincoats, said sales to tourists had risen 19% in London in 3 months to April, but they had tripled in Paris and they were up 43% in Milan. He said that total sales had risen 28% in the UK for the year as locals and visitors from Europe, from the US, Asia, and the Middle East spent more, but he noticed a big surge in UK tourists spending in Europe, which was quite telling. He said, "We are disappointed that the government has chosen to scrap the VAT retail export scheme. It leaves the UK at a competitive disadvantage for global shoppers. We are celebrating the fact that we are a British luxury brand and very hopeful that when tourists come to the UK, they are coming to Burberry. We are really hoping that this tax change can be revisited." Akeroyd's comments come after the chair of Burberry, Gerry Murphy, described Brexit as a drag on the growth, and it has left Britain nursing the weakest COVID recovery among its big markets. Murphy told the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak that a decision to remove VAT refunds in 2020 had hurt the economy and was a spectacular own goal. A string of other British companies, including British Airways, Mulberry, and Fortnum & Mason, have bemoaned the decision and called on the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt to reverse it. So what do you make of the luxury industry, the luxury brands hitting out at the government over this VAT change from the Chancellor?
Well, I think, Scotland has to recognise, and we do recognise, that Scotland does contribute to the luxury brands, whether it be in our whiskey, whether it's in some of our foodstuffs. And, when I first read this story, I just thought, here's another example of the catastrophic, and that's not too harsh a word, I don't think, the catastrophic effects of Brexit, which are really coming home to roost now. Daily, we're hearing of examples from business people who have been quite reluctant to criticise Brexit up till now, seeing the catastrophic effects of Brexit. We had the car industry yesterday, and the lack of a battery production in the UK, and how that might affect the car manufacturers in the UK. So I think the government surely must be recognising that they really have to do something um, to try and get more cooperation with the EU. But instead of that, they're off to Japan to try and do more deals with Japan rather than looking to our nearest market, which is, of course, the EU. And I think we're going to hear more and more now of examples of where, as I say, Brexit is catastrophic to industry in Britain. And I think it will only increase right up to the next election. And hopefully we'll see the the Tory party and Tories and right wing parties wiped off the electoral map because they deserve nothing less.
Yeah, you mentioned the car makers, and that snowballs us right into our next story. Rishi Sunak has said that the UK is currently in talks with the EU over Brexit rules that could make some electric cars much more expensive after Germany's powerful automotive industry joined other leading car makers in calling for more time. Germany's main automotive lobby group, the VDA, joined calls on Thursday for an extension of a Brexit trade deadline for 3 years to avoid a 10% price rise on electric vehicles that cross the Channel to the UK. The Brexit deal, struck between the UK and EU at the end of 2020, contained rules of origin, which were intended to spur the creation of domestic electric car battery industries to ensure that the region does not remain dependent on Asian battery imports. However, new factories have not sprung up quickly enough, meaning that some car makers may face the prospect of tariffs on exports in January. Speaking at the G7 summit in Japan, Mr. Sunak signalled that the UK would be willing to reopen part of the trade deal to give car makers more time. The VDA said it is now urgent to adjust the deal because tariffs would represent a significant competitive disadvantage for the European car industry in relation to its Asian competitors in the so important UK market. Tariffs would slow down the shift to electric cars, it argued. The VDA's members include some of the world's most powerful car makers, such as BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Porsche, and Volkswagen. The UK represents an important and profitable market for the Germany's car makers, albeit a small part of their global sales. Car makers have had 2 years to prepare for the deadline, but the flurry of lobbying was triggered by Stellantis, the owner of brands including Vauxhall, Fiat, and Peugeot, telling a UK parliamentary committee that it needed more time to source batteries from within Europe. Ford, Jaguar, Land Rover, and the European Automotive Manufacturers Association on Wednesday joined Stellantis in publicly calling for the deadline to be extended. Under the rules, all cars exported to the UK from the EU or vice versa must source 40% of their parts by value from within countries in the trade deal. However, that proportion is due to rise on the 1st of January to 45%, and in 2027, it will rise to 55%. As most electric vehicle batteries are still imported from China, South Korea, and Japan, the batteries make up a large part of the cost of building a car. Vehicles made both in the UK and EU are likely to fall foul of the rules. So, Maureen, there's a theme coming up with this competitive disadvantage. It was mentioned in the Burberry story, and it's obviously mentioned here. Where do you think that the competitive disadvantage comes from, obviously within relation to Brexit and the economic recovery?
Well, this is an absolute minefield of bureaucracy, isn't it? And if you remember back to Boris Johnson saying, we'll get Brexit done, as if it was so easy, and all of this sort of stuff was either overlooked or covered up at the time of Brexit by Boris Johnson and David Frost, Lord Frost. And they should be hanging their heads in shame, but of course are not. But, talk about Brexit red tape as if it was somebody else's fault. the fault lies totally with the Tory Westminster government that all this has happened in relation to the cars. And, I'm not sure where this thing about 40% of cars by value needed to be manufactured in Britain, as I understand what you said. But it just created a real mess for the car industry. As you say, cars coming into the UK and cars going out of the UK. And again, it seems to be that Britain's playing catch up on this because we've got no battery manufacturer in the UK. And there was one, if I recall, in Teesside, or certainly northeast of England, that went bust recently because things didn't work out. Well, that's ridiculous. The government should be making sure that things like this do survive for the long-term future of the car industry. And I can't remember the car industry itself, kicking up a fuss about the battery factory going into administration. I'm not sure why. There seems to be a lot of unanswered questions for me here in this story, but perhaps they'll come to light in a long article, really explaining somewhere, Economist or something, explaining exactly what's happening here.
Okay. So, moving on, the Japanese Prime Minister is intending to push in Hiroshima for a nuclear weapons pledge at the G7 summit. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Chinese aggression towards Taiwan will dominate the G7 discussions this week, but host Fumio Kishida is expected to carve out time to push for a pledge on nuclear weapons when leaders meet in Hiroshima, the first place on Earth targeted by an atomic bomb. The leaders begin to arrive today ahead of the expected visit on Saturday to the city's Peace Memorial Museum, which contains exhibits showing the scale of the tragedy that unfolded after the US dropped a nuclear bomb on the morning of the 6th of August, 1945, killing 140,000 people by the end of the year. The need to reference the dangers of nuclear weapons has intensified since Barack Obama became the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima in 2016. Vladimir Putin has refused to publicly rule out the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, whilst North Korea continues to develop more sophisticated missiles theoretically capable of delivering nuclear warheads to the US mainland. Kishida's decision to select Hiroshima, where he has a constituency, to host the summit comes with a heavy dose of symbolism, whose most striking physical presence, the A-bomb dome, will be within sight of the leaders when they lay flowers at the Cenotaph to the 333,907 people whose deaths have been attributed to the atomic bombing almost 8 decades ago. In the run-up to the summit, Kishida spoke of a desire of a world without nuclear weapons, although campaigners point to the failure of Japan, part of the US nuclear umbrella, to sign a 2021 UN treaty banning the possession or use of nuclear weapons. Pressure is building for a reference to nuclear weapons within the UN, with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres this week calling on G7 leaders to declare that they will not use nuclear weapons under any circumstances. This is the moment in which we must insist on the need of revitalizing disarmament and especially nuclear disarmament, Guterres told Japanese media ahead of his visit to Hiroshima. Maureen, just a quick comment. Do you think that nuclear disarmament should be a pressing issue in these kind of international summits? Do you think that that is a correct avenue for these countries to be pursuing?
Absolutely. And I'm really pleased that the Japanese government are taking this opportunity of hosting the G7 summit to press this home and have the meeting in Hiroshima. I think that is, as you said, a very significant venue, and hopefully will drive home the need to these very powerful countries for the need for nuclear disarmament. And, the war in Ukraine is not a reason for keeping nuclear weapons. For me, it's a reason for getting rid of nuclear weapons, and it has to be done. If it's going to have, I mean, I would like it, the UK and Scotland to be unilaterally free of nuclear weapons, but I can see that it's got to be done on a multilateral basis. But if the countries are there together and can say to each other, well, I'll do it if you do it, or we have a phased program of doing it, I think that is a really powerful message that could come out of this G7 summit. Do I think it will? We'll wait and see.
Yes, it has potential to be like you were saying, hugely powerful. So back to domestic politics, the Scottish Government has announced new food security units. This is to ensure Scotland's food security by monitoring the supply chain for possible disruptions, which is the focus of a new dedicated food security unit. Its establishment was a key recommendation of the Food Security and Supply Task Force, which was set up by the Scottish Government together with industry immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The new Food Security Unit will take forward the legacy activity of the task force. It will monitor food system resilience and engage widely so that the government and industry are able to react as quickly as possible to any future shocks. Speaking ahead of a parliamentary debate on securing a sustainable food supply for Scotland, Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Gorgon said in the recent past, we've seen several significant events impacting our food and drink sector, including COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, and crucially, the UK's government's choice to pursue a hard Brexit, which took us out of the EU and the single market. On top of this, there has been further disruption to supply chains resulting from climate volatility, something that we are likely to see more of in the future. I want to ensure that we are able to anticipate and adapt shocks as much as possible whilst we develop policies to try and mitigate them and reduce their likelihood. Our farmers and crofters are essential to Scotland's food security, and I am committed to supporting our nation's producers. Maureen, do you think that this policy and that this new action group, do you think that it has the potential to be successful in its aims?
Well, as a farmer's daughter, I really hope it does. The amount of food that is grown in Scotland and consumed in Scotland has decreased over the years of my life rather than increased. And if this signals a shift in that, I think it will be really good. It will give our farmers certainty and continuity, and hopefully reasons to expand the growth of food at home, which is bound to be a good thing in terms of, not just food security, but the safety. We know that our farmers grow to very high standards of health, and and it will save on food miles. So all of it, I think, if it has an emphasis on growing at home where and when we can, and help to extend the seasons perhaps through the use of polytunnels or whatever, or different grains, then I think it's really a step in the right direction. And I hope it's followed through by all the players in this field.
Mm-hmm. As a fellow country girl, I agree with you on everything there. So our final story of the night, a new factory is planned to generate 150 new green jobs in the Highlands. Sumitomo Electric Industries has confirmed that it will invest more than 200 million in its planned new Highland subsea cable factory and create 150 highly skilled green jobs. Energy Secretary Neil Gray, who discussed the investment with senior company executives in Osaka last month, welcomed the confirmation. Gray said Sumitomo's proposed investment in Scotland can promote rapid expansion of the renewable industry by connecting hundreds of offshore wind turbines. I met senior company executives in Osaka last month to discuss this investment, and we are working closely with our enterprise agencies and other partners to support and ensure it delivers maximum benefit for Scotland. These will be highly skilled green jobs from a business with a strong record in producing high voltage underground cables. The cables and the wind turbines they connect can help reduce emissions as a part of the fastest possible just transition from our oil and gas workforce. Scotland has the skills, the talent, and the natural resources with which to become a global renewable energy powerhouse. Through our draft energy statement and just transition plan, we aim to take advantage of the enormous opportunities offered by becoming a net zero economy by 2045. Maureen, this final story hopefully is steps in the right direction regarding some of the previous stories that we've had tonight. Would you agree with that? Do you think that this is a step in the right direction?
This is absolutely a superb story, and congratulations to Neil Gray for securing this investment from the Japanese firm to make cables. Presumably, he did it in the face of civil servants and Foreign Office people listening in to all our conversations. But this is an example of where ministers going abroad has secured investment in the country, and that's what we need. And we need the independence to do more of this in the future without the interference of the UK government. But this is really important to get this cabling manufacture here. We seem to have missed out on wind turbine manufacture, or maybe certainly not as fast as we could have had. And if we get a foothold in the cabling, which is going to be massive, then this is really good news for the Highlands. So well done to Neil Gray, and I hope it's first of many.
And so that was our final story. Thank you so much, Maureen. You've been a fabulous guest. Thank you for all of your input tonight.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
So that's it for this evening. Thank you for joining us. Before you tune out, I just wanted to remind you that, of course, at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our viewers, our supporters. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who already has signed up to make regular monthly payments, thank you so much. Our programs will, of course, always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've set ourselves the target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ a staff, to make more programs for you at home to enjoy. Thank you so much for watching. I've been Saoirse Healey. Thank you and good night.